And it's time for a moment in African history. We're doing a rewind today because stories like this need to be told and 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 told again, over and over and over again. So that's what we're going to do. And we're talking about Abdulrahman ibn Sori. So today we're going to delve deep into African history. We're going to go all the way back to 1788 as we recount the tale of an African prince who was stolen from his kingdom and sold into slavery. Okay? Oh, spoiler, he managed to make it back to Africa. So we'll come back to that. So you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Let's begin. So Abdulrahman ibn Sori was the West African royalty before he was enslaved on the Mississippi plantation. After a shackled journey across the Atlantic, Abdulrahman ibn Sori was desperate to make the man about to purchase him, Thomas Foster, understand his terrible mistake. He wasn't supposed to be enslaved. The 26-year-old was the heir to one of Africa's most influential kingdoms. But instead of freedom, his protestations earned him the derisive nickname Prince, which he'd carry on for the next 40 years of enslavement. Sori had arrived in Natchez, Mississippi after being kidnapped by enemy troops in 1788 in his native Fouta-Djallon in what is now Guinea. The powerful royal was sold to slave traders for a few muskets and rum at the height of the global slave trade, when an estimated 80,000 Africans were captured, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic every year. Despite the scale of the trade, Sori was one of 12.5 million Africans forced from their homes and sold to the New World between 1525 and 1866. Detailed narratives of individuals forced into bondage are limited, particularly of Muslim slaves like Sori. He's an exception because he was a highly educated aristocrat. His dramatic quest for freedom would eventually catapult him into the national celebrity, which means his remarkable life is more documented than most. Sori's story is an insight not only into the brutalities of slavery, which undergirded the global economy for generations, but on the way some enslaved people managed to manipulate dire circumstances. In his decades-long battle for liberty, Sori would weave a web of duplicity so dramatic that it would ensnare not only American President Quincy Adams, but the Sultan of Morocco as well. So, going back to Mississippi when he was sold. So, Foster ignored his protestations and marched him to his frontier homestead in Natchez, Mississippi, which was still Spanish territory at the time. It was a far cry from Timbo, the trading hub where Sori's father had consolidated power in Fouta-Djallon. Sori had been educated in Islam and politics in neighboring Timbuktu, and by the time he was captured, he spoke at least 5 languages and was the head of a 2,000-person army. Sori was horrified by how primitive and underdeveloped Natchez was. The kingdom of Fouta-Djallon was a very sophisticated society at the time, and Islamic scholars have said this was a period of real intellectual expansion. They had a constitution, they had laws. Foster made haste with cutting off Sori's long hair, a sign of his nobility in Fouta-Djallon, and forcing him into vicious manual labor. Refusing to stomach the humiliation, Sori ran. For weeks, he survived in dense, unfamiliar terrain. Wanted posters sprung up and slave hunters pursued him to no avail, but eventually he realized there was no escape. During the isolation of being alone in the wilderness, it dawned on him that he was no longer a prince. He was no longer a warrior. From that point on, his dignity was based on his ability to master the circumstances that he was in. It was also when he realized a return to Fouta-Djallon would not be possible, perhaps ever. Faced with no good options, Sori returned to Foster and set about making himself indispensable. An uneducated man who grew tobacco and herded cattle, Foster knew little about cotton, a crop of growing consequence in North America. Sori did, though, because cotton was grown in Fouta-Djallon. So with Sori's help, Foster became one of the region's leading cotton producers. As his plantation swelled, so did the Sori's influence. He became a foreman and met 25-year-old Isabella, a midwife who was also enslaved by Foster, and Sori going to marry her. The two had 5 sons and 4 daughters, and Sori's relative freedom meant he could grow vegetables and sell them at a local market. One market day in 1807, a chance encounter would once again radically alter his life. So let's rewind. Decades earlier, a shipwreck had left a British surgeon named John Cox marooned on the West African shore. He only survived because he was rescued by a group of Fulanese who brought him to Timbo. He met Sori and his royal family, who offered him medical care and friendship over a 6-month stay. In a remarkable twist of fate, Sori ran into Cox at the market where he was hawking vegetables in Mississippi. Cox saw an opportunity not only to right a grave injustice, but to repay his debt to Sori's family. He set about trying to buy his freedom, but Foster refused at any cost. Sori had been with him for nearly 2 decades at that point, and his knowledge was too valuable to lose. Cox would spend the rest of his life trying to purchase his one-time host's liberty. While his efforts were ultimately fruitless, they did get Sori another form of currency, local celebrity. Word of the fantastical story of chance meetings on either side of the Atlantic spread quickly around town, and when Andrew Marshall, a local newspaperman, heard about it, his interest was piqued. After Marshall found out that Sori spoke Arabic, he leapt to the conclusion that Sori was Moroccan. Not wanting to slow his enthusiasm and probably understand that the American racial hierarchy placed Moors well above West Africans, Sori chose not to correct him. It would be the first of many strategic evasions Sori would make in the years to come. Sori asked Marshall to help him get a letter to Africa, and Marshall agreed. Sori took several years, but eventually produced what was likely copied Quranic verses, and Marshall used them to authenticate, quote unquote, Sori's Moorish origins, and attach his own letter expressing Sori's desire to join his relatives in Morocco, which he sent to the United States consulate in Tangier. Word of Sori's predicament eventually got to the Sultan of Morocco, and from there, the news of a captive royal wound its way back to the U.S. government. And worried about diplomatic relations, Secretary of State Henry Clay arranged for Sori's release in 1828. Foster agreed to Sori's release with compensation, under one condition, that he be transported directly back to Africa without ever enjoying the privileges of a free man within the United States of America. Sori's freedom was imminent, but Isabella and his children were not. His determination to return to Fouta Djallon was matched only by his refusal to not do so without his family. As he prepared to travel to Washington, D.C., from which he would set sail to Africa, word of his epic grew. Newspapers covered his odyssey, and events along the route were planned in his honor. Everywhere he went, word of an enslaved man who could not only read and write, but was a skilled orator and claimed to be a Muslim prince, drew crowds of shocked and gawking onlookers. But before he left Natchez, Marshall gifted him a traditional Moorish costume for the trip. Sori was a showman and planned to use the trip as an opportunity to fundraise for his children's freedom. A costume would only help. He was quickly able to buy Isabella's freedom, but he had to continue looking for funds and donations for his children, even asking the president, Quincy Adams, for funding, which Adams refused. Okay? So, his predicament caught the attention of an influential figure. This time was Thomas Gadulay, one of the founders of American School for the Deaf and part of the American Colonization Society. We talked about that before. They were sending people back to Africa. And he saw Sori as an opportunity to spread Christianity across Africa. Sori also saw an opportunity, the chance to rub shoulders with people who would donate to his fund to buy his children. And to prove his commitment to Christianity, Gadulay asked him to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic for use in missionary work, and Sori agreed. But this time, things were starting to change. Andrew Jackson was preparing for a presidential bid against Adams and used Sori as a campaign tool, ridiculing Adams for his support. Foster caught wind of Sori's efforts to free his enslaved children and threatened to revoke Sori's freedom. Okay? So Marshall, not wanting to come down the wrong side, turned his back on Sori. And that's how everything went all bad again, because Sori's tale of his descent, everything unraveled. People found out he wasn't Moroccan, and all the donations started to dry up. Sori had only had half the funds to buy his children back, to free his children. So once again, he set across the Atlantic, and that was it. He set out for Africa with his wife without his children. Well, their plan was to get to Africa and then send for their children when they made some money, desperately hoping their kids would be able to follow. So when he arrived in Monrovia, Liberia in March of 1829, the first thing he did was unroll his prayer mat and bow to the earth. Sick and weakened by the journey, he would contract a fever just 4 months later and die at age 67. He would never return to Fouta Djallon or see his children again, but he did manage to return to his beloved Africa. Years later, though, Gadulay would find out that Sori had not in fact written the Lord's Prayer in Arabic when proving his commitment to Christianity. He had instead copied from memory the first chapter of the Quran, which he knew from memory. Sometimes history is not only written by the victors. That's it. Did I depress you guys, or did I inspire you?
That was inspiring in the beginning and in the middle, and then I was like, wow.
I'm sorry.
Tragic.
I'm sorry. It's not tragic.
No, not to an extent.
It's tragic of what man does to man, man's inhumanity to man. And the fact that he was with Foster for so many years.
And he still did that to him.
Yeah, he worked with him for over 20 years. And he said, you know what, my guy, you've done so well for me. Here you go. Do your best. You're good for me. You're good for my work. You stay here. And if you have to go, you don't take anything. You go back to Africa immediately. I mean, it's just...
No, that's messed up.
And he had troops. He spoke several languages. He was a proper prince. Not like prince, everybody says I'm a prince. He was like an actual prince of a kingdom. Somebody who had hosted somebody for 6 months. Like, it's such a waste. It's such a waste. Slavery was such a waste of so many good people.
It was.
Absolute waste. Anyway, so
not to dwell on the past.
It took him 40 years to return to Africa, but he did it. 40 years.
And died in how many months after returning?
4 months.
Bruh.
4 months. And he never even got back to...
40 years, 4 months.
Never got back to Putajalo, and he was in Liberia right when he died. This story is people of our people and their strength in the face of insane adversity, and we need to cling to in times of wavering confidence, okay?